Go ahead.
Okay, I just want to focus on the whole idea of this woke culture just for a second. Because it's not so obvious to some people. And for me, whenever I'm looking online and I'm reading Twitter and I see tweets like yours, people who share similar ideas, it's always really refreshing. And I don't understand why, because you said it's a bit more subtle compared to the CCP, which isn't so subtle. For me, it's the same thing. It's just different, right? Like it's communism and it's exactly the same thing. And it's what's coming over here to the West. But it's done with this whole, you must submit because, you're privileged and it's not fair and we've got to help and we've got to be kind. It's comes from a more moral standpoint. So my question is, why isn't it so obvious? Because you kind of brush past this as if it's so obvious, as if, we can easily compare this to the CCP and what's happening there, but it's not so obvious to some people, even in the crypto community. It's not so obvious. People wearing masks and things like that in like profile pictures and all these things, like there's a lot of signaling going on and it's not always so obvious to people. So why would you say that it is a bad thing?
Okay, great question. So first, one thing I would observe, so actually David Shore, who's a pretty smart guy on the, Democrat side, I wouldn't consider myself to have any political labels, but I was able to actually note something after the election that most people wouldn't be able to note, which is actually the Democrats actually gained in the white vote, and Republicans actually gained on the minority side, right?
Which is surprised.
Okay. Well, so that's contrary to a lot of the narrative or what have you. And what I think is interesting about this is I think we're starting to see something which is sort of like these extremely woke white people who are expiating sins, real or imagined, for inheriting money or something like that. Like a lot of these people are like Choate and Andover and Exeter or whatever grads, and you find that it is the privileged whites who call out, quote, other people's white privilege the most, right? The privileged whites are concerned with other people's white privilege. And this is a weird form of expiating their own guilt because they know that they inherited something, they didn't found it. But the way they expiate that guilt is conveniently by tearing down other people, right? By tearing down, some poor Southern guy or some guy in the Midwest or some plumber in New York as being, quote, white privilege, as if they actually were, going to Exeter and Choate and so on and so forth, right? So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect is that people like yourself or myself who have some intersectional credential, right? Like being non-white or a woman or what have you, right? And actually, that's a vast majority of the world. If you think about it, only something like, depending on how you count, less than 20% of the world is white. I don't know the exact percentage. Something like 80% is, quote, people of color, right? And then you add women and so on and so forth. Almost everybody has like some intersectional credential, okay?
Yeah.
Because of that, we can sort of, we have like some shield or armor in this stupid social media game, right?
Yeah.
The third thing as to why this thing is popular is, do you know the concept of immune escape for viruses?
No.
Okay, so a virus can be targeted by like a vaccine, but it can develop a mutation that lets it wiggle out of that.
Yeah.
Okay, so essentially it mutates and now it's escaped your immune system or it's escaped the vaccine. Okay, this is actually something I tweeted about the other day. So if you think of communism and Wokism as mind viruses, okay, basically people, I think this is actually a very deep concept. I'm going to go deep on this for a second, right? But if you think of them as mind viruses, yes, Wokism has structural similarities to communism. Okay, but there's some fundamental differences that have let it immune escape. If you think about it, much of the world was vaccinated against communism over the course of the 20th century at the cost of 100 million dead. If you read, Stephen Courtois' book, I think it's Courtois, the Black Book of Communism, right? You remember who wrote it.
Okay, that's interesting. So you're saying we're vaccinated against communism. Oh, I see where you're going with this. Okay.
Partially, right? But the thing is, Wokism versus communism. So communism was the redistribution of wealth. Wokism is the redistribution of status, right? Communism was ostensibly for workers and peasants. Wokism is ostensibly for women and, quote, minorities like yourself and myself, right? Communism was about the union strike, and wokeness is about the woke mob. Communism's setting was a factory floor, and wokeness's setting is social media. And so the thing is, why did communism spread? If you actually go back and look at it, I mean, this thing started with a book, and it grew to control an enormous swath of the Earth's, surface, right? The USSR, China, Cuba, like this thing did appeal to people. It did, quote, win against, more practical philosophies. Why is that the case, right? And part of the reason is, it's not the only reason, there's several reasons. Part of that is the microeconomic incentives for communism, okay? So that's to say, if you were like a Jurgis Rudkis, do you know who that is?
No.
Okay, so from this book, Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, right? If you go and read that book, you'll get a sense of what attracted people to communism. These guys were working in factories. They were going through this wrenching transition of the Industrial Revolution. They were alienated from their farms and their homes. Sometimes children were being worked really hard. There were disasters like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And so much opprobrium was heaped on the unethical owner who had all this leverage and could, bankrupt you or, put you out of work. And, the family farm that you had wanted, that was now being bankrupted by these big factories that, or big, industrial operations. You just couldn't make it as a family farm anymore, right? All those were real things. And so, what happened was some guy came into a factory, and they basically say, we've got the answer, it's communism, and here's why. Here's what you got to do. You build a union and do strikes, and then what you'll do? Everybody here will get some money. Why? Because you'll make that boss bend, that boss who's so powerful. All of us together are strong, and we'll make him bend, and now we all get raises. Whoa, oh my God, the strike worked, holy cow. And that would get reported in all the communist papers, and everybody would, raise their fist, oh, we did it. And then the hangover the next day or the next week or so would happen because you'd have union dues, right? That would actually be coming out of your paycheck. That was increased, now it's decreased. You have a second boss, which is like the union manager on top of the other manager, right? You suddenly have speech and thought controls. So Elia Kazan had this movie on this in the mid-20th century called On the Waterfront. You ever heard of it?
No.
Okay, worth watching simply to get a sense of that time and place, where basically you'd be canceled for totally different things, but essentially being disloyal to the union, or which could expand into lots of things, like working a little too hard, and trying to make us look bad, all of those kinds of things, right? You can start to see how that would be cause for cancellation, and you'd lose status among the other workers. And so the combination of all these things meant that your factory, your company became less competitive over time. But what you're basically doing with a strike is debiting from the future to build with the present. Now, with that said, a strike is a pressure tactic. What the workers, the communist workers, thought was happening at that time, they thought it was a zero-sum situation where the boss would lose and they would win. It turned out to actually be a negative-sum situation where they were actually harming both parties over the long term, including themselves, by making the company less competitive. But they didn't understand that because they could only see it was a negative-sum situation with a short-term positive gain. It's like getting in a very high interest rate credit card kind of thing. You get the money today. It sort of tricks the psyche, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So that's like part of the microeconomics of it. The other aspect, of course, is the religious zeal. Nietzsche wrote in the late 1800s, quote, God is dead. And what he was observing was he wasn't actually inveighing against God in that particular epistle. He was basically saying, there's enough educated people who don't believe that there's going to be wars beyond imagining. People are going to look to fill effectively that God-shaped hole. And what a lot of people did is they filled their worship of God with GOV, right? With the government, right? The government can do everything, right? There's an ad a while back which was government is the thing we all belong to, right? And so essentially people project onto it this monotheistic thing of the All-Father, right? The everything. Yeah. And so they basically, they're quote secular, but they actually believe in this thing as Green Lantern because it's like the most powerful thing, right? They literally worship, the government, right? So there's a second aspect in the vacuum of God, people projected all of this power onto this thing. Okay. So these are some of the reasons communism spread. Now let's bring it to wokeness, right? Wokeness has done immune escape. It doesn't look exactly the same as
I get that.
So for one thing, basically, do you know what the hard hat riot was, 1971?
No, I'm saying no to everything. My God, what is that?
So the hard hat riot was 1970, actually. So that was actually the flip, okay? Basically, for essentially about 70 something, actually more than 100 years, the working man and his noble nature, that was essentially like the backbone of communist, revolutions all across the world, right?
Yeah.
But in 1970, an important flip happened where union workers in the US came out to beat up the hippies who were protesting against the Vietnam War. which meant that union workers had basically been cut in to American prosperity enough that they didn't feel alienated like the guys from 50 years ago, right? This, by the way, rather than the win-lose situation or the negative sum situation, the win-lose situation is exploitative boss, right? The negative sum situation, really lose-lose, is the union strike. The win-win is actually aligned capitalism, right? So the way to meet communism in the past, the way that actually worked was aligned capitalism, where to avoid this negative sum situation where you as a CEO or the executive are harmed and your workers are harmed, even if the strike organizers don't get it, you cut them in on the pot. This also eventually led to startups and to equity shares and so on and so forth, where you're not seeing that you are aligned, you're proving it by giving them a slice, right? I'll come back to this point. But basically that was actually, I think, the solution. Now, this is actually working well enough. Now, let me also give an asterisk, because I know some people are going to say, that was working well until 1971, we got off the gold standard, then workers were no longer given such a cut. I agree, I'll come back to that. But let's just say, take it back to 1970, okay? So 1970, the hard hat riot, these guys, the union guys went out and beat up the hippies, and many people realized, wait a second, the host for the mind virus is no longer these white working class guys. So now they were like considered the most noble thing in the freaking world for basically 70 years, right? More than that, like 100-something years. That like all the bloodshed, everything was for them, the working man, and so on and so forth, right? And all the faults were airbrushed. Now we suddenly saw a mirror image where this guy who was super noble became Archie Bunker, and all his negative traits were stressed: the racism, the sexism, the homophobia. These are all caricatures that like probably some truth